Currently, this is our application. We have a question, we have an answer field, and we have a bunch of cards on our screen that we can edit and look at. Okay, but what if you had to get these questions from somewhere else? For example, maybe you have a database, or you have, in this case, a server. And the server has a bunch of questions and a bunch of answers. And you want to take the questions and answers that this server has, that the server will provide to you, and you want to put that inside your page. How are we going to do that? Well, that is where we're going to use effect, and we're going to use fetch. So fetch is for storing data, and useEffect is a hook, a React hook that we'll be using to run specific code when the app loads. So when we're getting data from a server, there are three things that can happen. One is we are in the loading state. Loading means we're still fetching data. One is we're in the failed state. Failed means we failed to fetch data. And one, we're in the success state. Success state means data has successfully been retrieved from the server. So we have to save these states inside our application, because while loading, we want to show maybe a loading or a spinner. If it says failed, we want to show an error message. And if it says success, we want to load the cards, right? So we'll be going over that in this section. So before anything else, I want you to understand one key term, which is called a side effect. So what is a side effect? Side effect is basically anything that a component does that is not drawing itself on the screen. So the main purpose of a component is to draw itself on the screen, right? Like our app component is drawing a header, a form with input fields, and it's drawing a paragraph, it's drawing a button, it's drawing a div and stuff, right? So all a component does, so the main job of a component is to draw itself onto the screen. A side effect is anything aside from drawing itself on the screen. So maybe like talking to the internet, maybe fetching data, if our component is fetching data, if our component is setting a timer, or if our component is reading the browser. So we'll look at this later. So a component can look at cookies and local storage and stuff. So we'll get into that as well. So anything that a component does aside from drawing itself on the screen is a side effect, which includes talking to the internet, fetching data and stuff. So the one we'll be looking at is fetching data. Fetching data from the internet is also a side effect. So for example, you have a database somewhere with a bunch of question and answers, and you want to load it into your application right here. So your component in that case would have to fetch that data from your server, which is a side effect, okay? So React actually gives us a special tool to run these at the right moment, to know when to run these, and that is called the use effect. We're going to use this hook. So anything with the name use and something is called a React hook. So what we looked at right here, use state. Use state is also a React hook that allows us to access memory. Use effect is a special tool to run side effects at the right time. What we want to do is we want to fetch our cards only once. As soon as the page loads, we want to fetch our cards. We don't want to continuously keep fetching our cards, right? We want to fetch it once right when the app first appears. So we're going to handle how we're going to do this by using use effect. Okay? So to start using use effect, similarly how we imported use states, I'm going to import use effect. All right, it's now we're using use state for a memory tool, and we're going to use effect for managing, let's say managing side effects for now. Managing side effects. Okay, now to set it up, you do it exactly how we set up our use state. Use effect also works in the same way. In fact, all React hooks work in the same way. So I'm going to create a const for cards and set cards. and I'm going to use state empty. Before, what we did was we had our own cards. So we use state and then we use the cards that we have already. But right now, we don't want any data that we already have. So I'll remove this and I'll remove this. What I'm doing now is I'm going to create an empty array in memory to hold our cards. Okay, previously we already had an array and we loaded that onto our memory, but now I want an empty array to hold our cards. So if I go to our page right now, our page will have no cards because we're loading an empty array. Okay, and we want to fetch data from the internet and put it into this empty array so that it can be loaded onto the screen. Now, there are a few things that can happen when we're fetching data. One is, are we still waiting for the data? If we're still waiting for the data, we need to keep track of that. So we're going to create a loading and set loading state. So we're going to use state, and by default, it is true. By default, we're loading. By default, we're trying to get data because we start with an empty array and we're getting data. Next, we want to check if we got an error. So did it go wrong? Did it go wrong when fetching data? So for that, const is, we're going to say, let's say error, and set error. By default, use state is going to say that we didn't get an error. By default, we don't have any error. But if we do have an error, then we're going to set error to set an error. So all I changed right here was now our cards are just empty. Our cards point to an empty array, and we can use set cards to put items into that array. We have another use state for loading. By default, loading is true, and we can set loading to set loading true and false. And the last thing is error. So by default, it is false because you have no errors by default. Now, the next thing that you need is the actual skeleton, the useEffect skeleton. How do we use useEffect? Well, what does it do? It runs the code inside after the component first appears. So for the first time that the component appears, after it has appeared, it runs whatever code it has inside it. Okay? So we're going to do useEffect, and it takes two arguments. The first is the code that it needs to run, which is going to be inside a function. So effect, the effect that is going to have. It runs a specific code inside after it appears, right? So the code that it runs is going to be inside here. Next, we give it an empty array. So empty array, you can see it says DEPS, which is dependencies. All this does is, I'm going to write it right here. The empty list at the end means run this on the once on load. So as soon as we load the page, I want to run it only once. Anytime you want to run it when something changes, you'll add it to this array right here. But right now, I just want to run it once. And this is your total useEffect skeleton. So it is a function. Inside the function, it has two arguments. The first argument is another function, which contains the actual logic that you want to run. And the second argument is an empty array, which basically means run it only once. Okay, now for our loading screen. I give you a way that we can check or we can put a condition on whether a thing shows on our page or not. And the way we did that was using simply these and symbols. If the card's length are 0, we show no cards yet. So this is a condition. A condition, when something is true, then you want to show an element. We want to render an element. If it is false, we don't want to render that element. So we're going to do the same thing, but for loading. So right here, we're simply just going to say, while waiting, show this. And the way we're going to do that is loading. So the value of loading by default is true, right? As soon as we load the page, the value of loading is true. Set loading, the use state, it's true by default. The only place where it becomes false is after all of our cards are loaded in or if we get an error. So until our cards are loaded in and until we get an error, we want to show that we're loading the data. So we want to make a paragraph tag, and all I want to say is loading data. Right? Now you can make this look pretty and all, that's not our concern for now. For now, I'm just teaching you the functionality. You can show a loading screen. So you might, instead of showing this element, you might show a screen or a cursor or a blinking something or like a spinning something. And you can do this, okay? And error. So if we failed to get data, show this. So simply to do that, error. By default, error is false. So this element won't render by default until and unless we manually set error to true. So could not load cards, try refreshing. Okay? The only place where we're setting error to true is if we fail to get data inside our catch block, set error to true. So if I go to my page now, and we've made this pretty advanced by now. So it says could not load cards, try refreshing. So we've errored. And if I open up our console, we can see that we've errored by a response code of 429. So the reason why you get 429, and you can Google this, so status code 429, it is when your API is overloaded. So if you send too many requests at the same time, your API will rate limit you and send 429. So if you refresh too fast, you get 429. Now, if I refresh, it says loading data while we're loading data, and it shows all of our data like so. And we're still getting an error, it seems like, inside our console. So we're still getting 429 because I've made a lot of requests in the past minute really fast. That's where we're getting this. But if I load it pretty fast and we don't get a data back, it says could not load cards. But if we do get our data back, the loading screen goes away. We still get this because our API is returning error. So this is not something that we can fix because the API itself is sending an error and the data at the same time. So this is not our concern. Inside our network tab, let's look at it. It says too many requests, but in response, it is sending data. So I don't know what's happening with the API. This is an API related issue, but on our end, everything works perfectly fine. Okay, now let's talk about fetch. I'll write it right here. We're going to use fetch. What is fetch? It is the browser's built-in tool for asking a website data, Anytime you want data from a website, you're going to use fetch. Well, it is a built-in tool. Later, we'll look at Axios as well, or maybe I'll make a different advanced video to talk about Axios. But what happens is the data, anytime you send a request for data, the data comes back as a JSON. So I'm sure you're familiar with JSON, but JSON is like a text that looks like object. So it is something that looks like objects that we had before, but it's not exactly an object. So it looks like this, but it is not this. You have to convert it into a JavaScript object. Okay? So JSON basically just stands for JavaScript object notation. You have to actually convert it to a JavaScript object to use it. Okay? So for this purpose, we will use a free trivia API. So we won't create our own API for now. We'll just use the free API. And we're going to put all the API, we're going to call the API for questions and answers, and we're going to use those. Okay. So inside useEffect, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to fetch. So I'm going to fetch this URL. So https open tdb open trivia.com/api.php amount equals to 6. So I'm going to call in 6 questions and answers, and en code equals to URL 39. So you can just copy this link. I actually want to open it in the browser and see what we get first. So if I open it in the browser and make sure you're removing the quotations, you can see that we're making a request to an API. And what this API gives us is it gives us a JavaScript object notation, so a JSON file. And inside this JSON, we have 6 different trivia questions. So if I put like, instead of 6, I put something like 60, it would probably give us 60 questions. Like so, it would give us 60 questions. So right now I want only 6. And you can turn pretty print on and see these questions. Okay, so this is of the type multiple. Difficulty is easy. Category is entertainment and video games. The question is, what is Call of Duty Black Ops based on? And the correct answer is Cold War. And we have a bunch of incorrect answers as well. So this is more of like a multiple choice question kind of thing, but we can easily convert it into our study deck because all we need is the category, the question, and the correct answer. So we're going to only concern ourselves with these 3 properties. So we can take these 3 properties and then create an object out of them. put that object inside our cards, and our page already has the loading cards function. So first of all, as soon as we fetch dot then, right? As soon as we fetch, the dot then runs only if the fetch is successful. If the fetch is successful, we're going to take the data. So the data that we got, this is the data that we got. And what we're going to do with the data is, first of all, we're going to convert them into our card shape. So before we actually do that, the data that we get right now is actually a response object. This is a response object. We actually have to take out this response code 0, and we want only what's inside the results, and we want it in a format that we can use. Right now, it's not in a format that we can use. So before we do this, right after we fetch, we take our response, so the response object. So this is the actual thing that we have right here. So all of this is the response. We need to first of all convert it into a JSON. So response.json. Simply converting it into a JSON file so that we can actually use it. Actually converting this JSON file into an object so that we can actually use it. So this is unusable because you can see it has double quotations here and here as well. But in JavaScript, when we use objects, we don't have double quotations on both sides. We have it only on one side. So on the right side, on the value side, we have double quotations. On the key side, we don't have it. So to convert it, you simply just call the function. You call the function response.json, so it converts it into a format we can use. Then we now have data. So after converting it into a JSON, we send it to the next dot then, which now has the data. What are we doing with the data? We turn it into our card. So we turn each item into our card shape. Okay. What we're going to do is const loaded. So we're going to create a variable called loaded, and simply like we mapped our cards right here, we did cards.map so that every single card item would be mapped. We're going to run another map function. Our map is going to take all of these one by one, right? So I'm going to do data.results.map. So data.results, because first of all, we have response code and results, right? So data.results goes inside this and then starts mapping all of these one by one. So this comes first, this comes second, this comes third, and so on. You get the point. So dot map, and we're going to get item and index. So index is the position of this item. So you can see that the index of this would be 0, index of this would be 1, index of this would be 2. And inside the item, we get the actual item itself. So inside the item, we get this entire object, and inside the index, we get 0 for first, and then the second object, 1 for second, and so on. So our ID is going to be the index. So the position, actually, instead of simply doing like so, you actually need to pass in small brackets here as well to create an object. So our ID is going to be index. So this would have the ID 0, this would have the ID 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. Our category is actually given to us right here. So we have a category field right here, okay? Category is going to be decode URI component and item.category. So inside item, remember, inside item, we have this whole item. So item.category would give us this value, but you can see this value has these percentage signs and everything else like numbers right here. And that is a URI component. Simply doing decode URI component makes it into a human readable language. Okay. Next, I want you to get question and answer yourself. So how would you get question and how would you get answer? I want you to do this yourself by looking at this response. The question is inside the data that we have. And of course, you would need to decode URI component on this as well. Okay, so I'll do it. You do decode URI component and simply item.question, because this is our item. Item.question would give us this value right here. And when we decode URI component on that value, you get the actual human readable syntax. Next, for answer, you do the same thing, but instead of item.question, you do item.answer. Now we have an object, and this object is in the exact same syntax as what we expect right here. We need a category, a question and answer, and an ID. And now we have category, question, answer, and an ID that we took out of this response. So we made a fetch response, we made a request to this API, which gave us a bunch of stuff. We looped through all of the results, and then we pulled out category, question, and answer and created an object out of them. Now, after we create an object, so if we successfully create an object, what I want to do is now I want to change our state. So I want to change a bunch of states. I want to set cards to loaded. So set cards changes right now. Currently our cards is empty, right? But I want to set cards to loaded. Since loaded is an array. Loaded is an array of all the cards. So we map through all of the cards and put it into the variable loaded. So by the end, loaded would go through this. It would get the ID of 0, since we used index. It would get the question, correct answer, and the category. Then it would move on. It would put this at the ID 1. It would get the category, question, and correct answer, and move on. And by the end, loaded has 6 different objects with all of these in the format that we need. Okay, and simply set cards loaded takes all of the data that we got and then puts it into our use state memory that points to cards. So now we can use cards and then we can access this thing that we converted from the API. Okay, right after that, I want to set loading. So since by default loading is true, now that we've loaded everything, I want to set loading to false. By default, our value for loading was true. I set it to false. The reason, you'll see why we're doing this, because when the cards aren't loaded, so this might take some time actually, this takes some time to happen, because even in this page, you can see that when I refresh, it takes some time to get the data. You see, it takes a few seconds before the data comes out. Oh, it takes a few seconds before the data comes out. So during those few seconds, our loading is true. And we want to show something on the screen while our loading is true. After we get our data, we set loading to false, and then we remove that component. And finally, you need something. So after all of our .thens are finished, you need a .catch block. So .catch simply does what it says. It catches any errors if it happens. So we might get an error while fetching the data. We might get error while converting it. We might get an error while mapping it. So any error that happens, we simply catch it. We catch that error and we set error to true. So if our set error is true, we want to show something on the screen. And set error is simply another state that we have right here. We set error to true and we set loading to false. You must set loading to false, because even if you got incorrect answer or if you got an error while fetching data, you're officially not loading anymore because you already loaded and you got an answer. It's either the correct data or the wrong data. If you got the wrong data, you set error to false. If you get the correct data, you set cards to loaded. But in both of those cases, you have to set loading to false. And now as such, we can now go to our page and we can go right here and we can refresh this and we can see we got a bunch of data. So you can see that we don't get the data immediately. And while we don't get the data, you get 0 cards in a deck, no cards yet. But in the background, our set cards is setting it to loaded, but our loading is true, right? While we're still waiting for the data, our loading is true. So instead of this, we want to show maybe like we're loading data or something. And if we get an error, so I think we just got an error here. That's why we don't see anything on the screen. If you go to your console, you can see the error. You can see the error if you go in the console. But right here, we don't know if we errored or if we got the correct data. So we also want to show if we errored right here. So if I refresh this, we get our questions. Let's look at one of our questions. So you can see the category is loaded properly. You can see the question is loaded properly. And if you click on it, you're getting undefined for all of the answers. I wonder why you're getting undefined. Let's troubleshoot that. Our answer is decode URI component item.answer. Let's look at our response. In our response, we have category question. Oh, this is the error. The field's name is correct answer and not answer. We're looking for something that doesn't exist. Answer doesn't exist. The only thing that exists is correct answer. So if I change this to item.correct_answer, we should be getting this field now. We should be getting the value for this field. Okay, and I'll save this and let me go to our page and let me refresh. So now if I click on this, it should say the correct answer. So how many times do you fight the imprisoned in the Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword? If I click on it, 3. So I did get the answer. And you can see for all of the other questions, I am also getting an answer. And all of my cards are working properly. Now, for example, you wanted 50 cards, for example. So simply right here in the URI, instead of saying 6, you can change this to 50, and all 50 of your cards will load without you having to create new elements. Throwback to when I said we needed data like this instead of making elements for each question. See, now that we have made data like this, we can simply add items into that array, and our entire application will load that for us automatically, handle everything for us. So if I say 50, and then now I load this page, it will try fetching 50 different cards. You can see that it fetched 50 different cards, and you can click on any card and get the answer for that card. And you have a bunch of trivia questions inside your card like this. But right now, there's an awkward moment. It's all blank when it's loading, and I want to fix that by showing something, okay? Also, the clear all should work.